kick off the second half of today's presentations, we are going to hear a broad systems perspective and then drill down into a specific model of pre-arrest diversion called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. Dr. Ed Mulvey is Allegheny County's Criminal Justice Coordinator, and he directs the Law and Psychiatry program at the University Pittsburgh School of Medicine. He will be giving us a framework to understand the spectrum of existing and needed interventions within the criminal legal system of Allegheny County. To view his full bio, click the link in the chat. Following Dr. Mulvey's overview of local strategies and barriers, we will take a deep dive into LEAD, which is the model that many stakeholders in Allegheny County are preparing to launch. Najja Morris, Director of the LEAD National Support Bureau, and retired Chief Brendan Cox, the Director of Policing Strategies at the LEAD National Support Bureau, will discuss LEAD and how this type of pre-arrest diversion can work alongside other interventions to support solutions within our system. Welcome, Ed. Thank you for being here.
Hi, I'm Ed Mulvey. I'm going to walk you through a report that we did a few years ago for the Department of Human Services about the relationship of the criminal justice system and the social service systems for people who end up in criminal justice with behavioral health problems. I did this in conjunction with my colleague, Carol Schubert, and I'm going to give you a little orientation and then tell you some of the things we reported out on. First thing I want to mention is this report's rooted in what's called a sequential intercept model, which you'll hear some more about today. And it basically just recognizes the sequencing of people going through the criminal justice system and different points where we could possibly intercept them and get them diverted out of the criminal justice system. Or I know diversion is a word, the definition of is oftentimes disputed. So let's just say if we can redirect them out of the criminal justice system somehow. And you see that this basically just lays out from the time that crisis lines or individuals call in something straight through to when law enforcement might arrive. And then the initial decisions are to detain the individual or arrest them. Then they go through court appearances at Intercept 3. And then Intercept 4, they come back through the jail, or Intercept 5, they come back through the state prison system. Each of these has its own points and considerations. I'm going to talk today really about this front end, mostly about the initial contact and the decision to arrest and hold for court appearance. These slides will contain the results that we report across all the intercepts, but today, given the time that we have, I'm just going to run through these first ones. Here's what we did. Looked at basically looking at each of these practices in the criminal justice processing and then seeing how these initial stages look in particular. We looked for gaps and opportunities at each intercept. And then we described some programs that might be identified that to be helpful in Allegheny County, given the situation we have here. How we did that, we looked at county DHS court and jail data and consolidated some data sets to get estimates of sample sizes and that sort of thing. We interviewed a lot of stakeholders across the criminal justice and service systems. We had group meetings with individuals. We did 2 cross-system workshops. In the course of this, we've interviewed about over 60 people in the social service world and in the criminal justice world to get a picture of what's going on at these different points. So let's start back at the beginning. Intercept 01, when somebody has a crisis in the community and law enforcement gets called in. Okay, what are we currently doing in the county that seems to make sense, or what resources do we have? We've got a crisis center, we've got mobile crisis teams, we've got a crisis hotline. It's not like we have to reinvent these things. They're there, they've been operating for years, they're established. We've got a CIT training that's prevalent among city police. Many municipalities also take part. It's a part of regular recruit training and ongoing training in the Pittsburgh City Police. And we've also got a community policing approach endorsed in the city and trying to expand throughout the city of Pittsburgh. What issues do we have? If you look at these ways they're operating, what do we find out when we talk to a lot of people? First of all, there's a lot of variability in the police about how much they know about behavioral health problems and how to address those issues. The crisis centers and mobile crisis teams, while they're there, it takes a long time to get them to come out. When you've got somebody on a call, they're yelling and screaming on the front porch. It's going to be 25, 30, 35, 40 minutes, 45 minutes. I don't know, but it's much too long for a police officer to be on the scene trying to figure out exactly how they're going to calm this down or handle it. You go to the other side and you talk to service providers, and they're really not crazy about taking these individuals. I mean, it's not they have anything against it. Personally, it's just these are complicated cases and they got wide ranges of problems, and oftentimes their services aren't really suited to address the range of problems that they find in these individuals. So what could you possibly do to improve this point at 0-1? A couple things. First of all, just get the data straight about how many CIT officers are trained, where they are, and where they're assigned, and then integrate that somehow with the 911 system so that the best outcome is if we got trained officers showing up at appropriate scenes where their training is needed. That currently is not done. It's pretty much a haphazard thing, and we hope it happens. The other thing is the first end of that is to think about the dispatchers and the call takers. What do they know about behavioral health? What do they know about assessments? Their protocols, they have elaborate protocols for assessing things and examining what those are for behavioral health calls and getting them to the right people or the right agencies to respond is really important. The other thing is once the officer's in the field, they've got to be able to obtain health consultation somehow. Increasing access, calling crisis and waiting 45 minutes is not going to be helpful. Okay, so it's not really an operable system. So somehow they got to get better access from the field. Also, getting some forums that get law enforcement and crisis centers, social service providers talking about cases has been done in a few different locales, and it really increases the understanding and allows people to see the barriers and issues that other respondents have. The last thing is some case processing and assessment center services that officers can take individuals to in lieu of jail booking. Oftentimes, somebody with behavioral health problem ending up in jail is largely because the officers and supervisors and everybody else don't know what else to do with them, okay? They're just not sure where else they can take them. Their job is to resolve that situation, and they need some place to help them resolve that situation or some service to help them resolve that situation, okay? All right. So now let's go to Intercept 2. All right, now we get the initial detention. Let's say somebody's been brought in and they've got initial court hearings, they've been arrested. What are the current practices here that seem to make sense? First, the jail conducts a behavioral health assessment in the booking center, and they put it into an electronic record. They've got a lot of information there. The data systems at DHS have an opportunity for earlier identification of people with behavioral health disorders. Getting those online and working together would allow somebody coming in the door who's known to DHS, who's their provider, what are we going to do in this situation? The other thing is pretrial services provides quick access to risk assessment results for magisterial district judges. They can get them to them quickly when cases come in to be arraigned. And provision of counsel at the early stages of processing and arraignment preliminary hearings is expanding and it appears successful. There's been a demonstration project to get more public defenders into that process, and it appears to be working pretty well. There's also video capacity in hearing courtrooms, okay? And that's good because that means we can use some technology and we don't have to go reinvent or reinvest. And the last thing is there are behavioral health resources specialists available in some courtrooms. Sometimes there are people in certain magisterial district judge courtrooms, and they can consult with them on the scene, and they've found that helpful and productive. The reports we had from magisterial district judges really is they have a lot of cases they just don't know what to do with, like 30 to 40% of their cases. They may continue them and tell the person let's get an assessment. Where do I get the assessment? Who pays for it? Who am I supposed to call? That sort of thing. With somebody there, oftentimes it's very helpful. Okay. Now, issues to address Intercept 2. More behavioral health training is desirable for judges, jail staff, public defenders, district attorneys. The level of nuance understood about behavioral health problems is rather low in law enforcement professionals. Also, some systems are needed to track how these cases are processed through the lower courts and the common pleas courts for appropriate dispositions for behavioral health problems. It's tough to know who has a behavioral health problem at what point and how that case actually works out. And it's hard to plan and it's hard to put in implementation unless we can figure that out. The other thing is jail procedures can be improved for alerting coordinating services with providers. If somebody comes in with a behavioral health problem, one of the first things you want to be able to do is, do they have a history? Do they have a provider? Who should I be calling to alert them to their presence here? Some automated notification systems have been put in some cities, and getting that sort of use of data might be very productive. Okay, so some improvements. Improve the jail-based infrastructure. We got a lot of systems tracking information in the jail. Some of them don't talk to each other, okay? And also linking them to the Department of Human Services quickly, as I say, to identify people with a history would be helpful. And some standardized method for determining who has a behavioral health problem of what type and of what severity would allow us to see how these cases end up. Do they stay longer? Do they get out earlier? A lot of clinical information for treatment in the jail, not a lot for tracking them across other systems. Okay. Some computerized service to notify juvenile justice-related services and other behavioral health providers automatically. I've already said this, and when a recent client enters the jail. Using telepsychiatry to provide assessment and consultation at arraignments and preliminary hearings. We can't have a mental health professional in every magisterial district court. We could, however, possibly have access to a mental health provider. Leave the mental health people one place and let them telecommunicate and provide telemental health to a variety of services. Also, the idea of increasing conditional bond at arraignment and preliminary hearings in identified cases when it's really appropriate and feasible. And that's what I was mentioning about more representation, okay? And platforms for some regional assessment and social service centers, some place that the police officers can take people for something in lieu of the jail. We just got to cut off that option. I don't know what to do, so we'll take them to the jail, all right? I'm not going to go through Intercept 3 with the courts and everything else. As I say, this will be covered in the handouts. I don't want to use up all my time going over everything. You can look at it, and I can gladly send anybody the report if they would like it. But I do want to go to a couple themes that did emerge across all of these intercepts. I'm flipping right through these. You can't even read them fast enough, believe me. Okay, so let me get to these. This is people re-entering and issues with probation and parole. Okay, and we're past Intercept 5. Cross-cutting themes. When you go across all of these intercepts in this report that we try to put together, there are a few things that come up. First thing is there's no single solution. You're not going to tinker with one piece of this long sequence of events and cure the system. The system has to have multiple interventions, and maybe there'll be some synergy between one part of the system and the other. The second thing is that you've picked up is this. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of integration and analyses that could yet be done of data sets that could give us valuable information. We collect stuff. We're not terribly good at integrating it at this point. The other thing is the positive involvement of district attorneys' offices. If this is something that's reported nationwide, those places that are successful in tailoring their systems and being innovative have an active district attorney's office. And because the district attorney charges, they're the ones that make the decision about further court processing upon what conditions. And they have direct connections to law enforcement and their energy, their help, their commitment is necessary in these sorts of activities. The thing I got back to in the beginning, expanding the private provider pool. There are not a lot of services that handle co-occurring disorders, are licensed for co-occurring disorders, and know what to do with people when they come in. Okay, so the more comprehensive service model has to be expanded somehow here. I mentioned already use of technology. Some telemental health can bring services to the system rather than telling the system saying we need somebody here all the time. We can't afford that, but we could possibly use telemental health a lot more. The other thing is housing. Everyone you go to and you say, what's going on? Why aren't people getting back in the community? With housing. Somebody spends 3 weeks a month in jail. They don't have anywhere to live most of the time anymore. They could lose a job. They have these the word is a rippling effect, basically, from being in jail. So housing is a major one. People have trouble finding affordable housing. People have trouble keeping it. Currently, there's some work going on in the Housing Authority to try to get regulations that are more favorable to taking people with criminal justice history. And I think that's an admirable step forward. The other thing is community centers of some sort. I keep mentioning this, but some place as an alternative assessment and engagement center that people can go to rather than ending up dropped in the criminal justice system and the jail. And learning communities for providers and criminal justice professionals. Individuals really have to learn from each other on this. There are many aspects of the criminal justice system that social service providers don't get, don't take into account, don't understand the implications of fully. There are many aspects of disorders and treatment that law enforcement professionals really only have kind of vague notions of what they are. If they can get together and learn from each other, and it can be a very positive experience. At least some communities have reported this, and I believe we're particularly open and possibly successful in those sorts of efforts. The last one is one that is definitely not least, but one that we definitely need, and that is basically to get people. I have my timer here. 1 second. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, the last one is peer support. This is the idea of getting people services in the criminal justice system and getting them to stay in services and use services and for services to be effective is for engagement. This is not a cure situation. We're dealing with people who have disruptions in their lives off and on and are living in very tenuous situations. And given that, they've got to have somebody to go to who they feel comfortable can help them through this. That isn't somebody you walk into in an office and wait behind a shield until they ask you your name and your number and blah, 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 blah. That lays all the burden on the individual. We need peers out there trained to engage people. So it's somebody to go to. It's the idea of a service that is more than just meeting with a professional on a standard model basis. And I think trained peer supports, trained peer forensic supports offer a great potential to address what I would argue is the major problem here, and that's engagement, and it's keeping that engagement. Given all that, I've gone through a lot of stuff rather quickly, and I look forward to the discussion, and I hope we can kick some ideas around some more. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I'm Najja Morris, and I'm the director of the LEAD National Support Bureau. And my work with LEAD first began back in 2013 as a case manager and then subsequently as a direct service supervisor. And I'll kick it to my peer, Brendan Cox.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm Brendan Cox. I'm the Director of Policing Strategies with the LEAD National Support Bureau. I've been here for about 4.5 years. And in my previous life, I was with the Albany, New York Police Department for about 23 years. And I was lucky enough to retire as the chief there, and we implemented LEAD in Albany in about April of 2016. And Najja, you just want me to jump right into presentation?
Yes, please.
So let's talk a little bit about LEAD and about the origins of LEAD and about how LEAD can work for folks. So LEAD started in Seattle in 2011, and it started because of the large racial disparities that were in the system, specifically with the arrests of folks for drug possession, drug sales, and sex work in a neighborhood in Seattle known as the Belltown neighborhood. And much like the rest of the country, the Seattle Police Department was working in a situation where they had one tool, that was the tool of arrest, to deal with street-level drug crimes. Open-air drug market, one avenue to go, lots of complaints from business owners, from community members around that open-air drug market. And the Seattle Police Department was acting on that the way all police departments, including mine back in Albany, were for open-air drug markets by making arrests. And they were not seeing great results, just as I'm sure folks in Allegheny County, when you guys make those arrests for drug possessions, minor drug sales, and sex work, and all those things that go along those lines. Because at the end of the day, the system, the criminal justice system, is just not set up to deal with folks with unmet behavioral health needs, folks living in poverty, folks that are homeless, and committing crimes that are driven by those issues, survival crimes many times. So the police were not seeing a big difference. They were getting a lot of complaints from the community, but there was a whole other group of folks that saw a big problem, and those were folks in the civil rights world. In fact, our bosses. who recognized that there was a large disparity in the racial breakdown of the folks getting arrested. Seattle's about 8% African American, but well over 60% of the folks being arrested in that neighborhood were African American. So clearly there was an issue. And as folks started to get involved in some lawsuits and some court action, they were sitting at a mediation table, and the captain from the narcotics unit of the Seattle Police Department looked across the table at the civil rights folks and basically said, let's just, for the sake of argument, agree that what we're doing is an issue and it's racially disparate. What would you have us do differently? We agree that what's happening now is not making any difference, that we're in fact not helping the issue. What would you have us do? And the civil rights folks said, we don't have an answer for you. We just know the status quo is not appropriate. This is not the answer. And both sides said, you're right. They said, we agree. So let's call a timeout and let's do something different. So the folks decided, let's build a new approach. And let's look at this as, what if we were able to build a system where an arrest was the last option for an officer? And not only would that be the last option for an officer, but we would actually build something better. We would actually build something where we'd get people a better service, we'd build better public safety, and we'd make people well. Like, how about that? Like, imagine that for a change. Because I know about myself, when I became a cop back in 1994, like, I thought that arresting somebody for possession of drugs who had a substance use issue or problematic substance use, that, like, I was actually helping them by arresting them. And I learned shortly in my career that, like, oh, that actually is not helping them, because they're just getting punished and coerced, and it's not helping. So Seattle built this thing called LEAD, and what they built was these core principles that we bring around the country, and those core principles are what really makes LEAD what it is. And they built this thing that enabled officers at point of crime to be able to say, I'm not going to arrest you today. Instead of arresting you, I'm going to offer you services. And those services are going to be, I'm going to make a phone call to a case manager. That case manager is going to come to the scene or meet me at the precinct. We're going to do a warm handoff. Criminal justice system is going to step away, and the case manager is going to take over, and they're going to start working with you in a long-term process in a harm reduction fashion with street-based long-term case management, and start building a relationship, getting down to what their true issues are, because we all know that change takes a long time. Changing behavior takes a long time, and not everybody's ready, willing, or able to take that large step into treatment, and treatment might actually not be the actual answer to what the issue is. So let's go ahead and let's build off that. And let's all agree that we need to take folks out of the system. Because when we look at it, and when Seattle looked at it, and we look around the country, we know that we have folks that are persistent offenders, folks that have been arrested 40, 50, 60 times, folks that have constant contact with police officers. Maybe they're not getting arrested, but every day they're coming into contact with police officers that the system doesn't have an answer for. The system can't address their needs. But if we get case managers involved, and we have case managers actually start to build on strategies that law enforcement not only does not have the time for, but doesn't have the ability to do that, we can actually address things. So when LEAD started, when we go to the Intercept points that Doctor was so good at going across, we're looking at that Intercept 1 when LEAD starts. We look at that pre-arrest diversion. Let's not push this person back into the system. Let's keep them out. They've committed a crime, but let's not arrest. Like, we don't need to go further into the system. We know we need a different solution, and we don't need anybody else to tell us that. But we also realize that we need a structure around this. So we want to have that intercept on the street. We want to make that diversion, but we need a structure. So the structure of LEAD is to have this overall group that oversees LEAD, of having kind of a board of directors. So this policy coordinating group. So the stakeholders, so the police department, the district attorney's office, the mayor's office, or the county, or the city manager, the sheriff's office, the folks that can say, we're bringing all these resources to bear, the folks that can say, this is the policy that's going to exist, civil rights agencies, folks that can say, this is what we're going to do when we have the power and authority to do this. And we're going to govern this body. We're going to do it as a collective group. We're going to win together. And if we have any losses, we're going to lose together. Like, we're in this together. And that's what Seattle led the way to show us all. Like, hey, we can have differences. It's okay to have differences, but we're going to do this all together. And that's what happened in Seattle. The Seattle folks did that together. So if we have all the policy people in the room, and we have the policy people saying we're going to do this, what's this going to look like on the ground? Because if we're getting these warm handoffs happening, if we're having the officers actually do this, and taking the leap of faith to say, hey, here's Brendan Najja, can you start working with him? I've known him for 5 years. I've arrested him 20 times. he's spiraled down. I need something different. And Najja now takes Brendan over and says, all right, let's start working and figuring this out. How are we going to know there's change? How are we going to know on the street things are working? How are we going to have communication? Ultimately, what gets built is this operation work group. So on the ground level, we have this operation work group, which is really a problem solving network that happens a meeting every 2 weeks, where we have case managers, police officers, assistant district attorneys, public defenders, service providers, all guided by the project manager, to come together and have a problem solving meeting to talk about, okay, Brendan got diverted 2 weeks ago. He did his intake screening, which is really about building a relationship and figuring out, what does Brendan need? Does he need housing? Does he need an ID? Does he need work? Does he want MAT? Does he actually want treatment? Or is he going to run the other way when I say, do you want treatment? What is it we're going to work on for him? So at that meeting, we find out what happened after the diversion, what is being worked upon. The officers can say, hey, Najja, I'm still seeing Brendan at the corner of 4th and Clinton every day. He's still causing issues at the bodega. Can you do some outreach to him again? Can you see if we can get him away from there? So that alternative response that everybody's looking for these days, that extra help on the street, something most cops don't ever see. Social workers actually on the street, something much different. So that meeting where we see those differences happen, where officers suddenly have that buy-in of recognizing that, hey, we have something that can work. So we have now this component where the operations folks not only get together to talk, but they all build a relationship. And when we talk about LEAD and we talk about harm reduction, we're talking about relationships. We're talking about the ability to understand where we all come from. We're talking about the ability to work together. And we're talking about the ability to bring a public health response to public safety, because this is about public safety. And we know we can increase public safety when we bring a public health response together and we bring partnerships together. So we have that policy level, we have that operational level. Now let's talk about the other folks we need. We need a community level to come in here. So policy, operation, community. So many of us have had, just like in Seattle, where the Public Defender Association, which is our parent organization, got involved and started these lawsuits that got everybody to the table to make LEAD, have had civil rights agencies really approach the city and law enforcement to say, we need to do something different, something that I had happen in Albany. So civil rights agencies many times take hold. And one of the things we've learned in implementing LEAD in over 60 jurisdictions in the US, and now we're doing it abroad in a few other places, is that we need that buy-in of the community, especially in today's atmosphere. We need community education. We need folks with lived experience to give us feedback. We need to be able to educate the community and have that transparency. So we start what we call as community leadership teams. And ultimately, they help us build transparency and help build us guidance. So those three key pieces really make up LEAD. And I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Najja. I just want to touch, there's two other ways to get in. One is that social contact referral. So the same folks with the same criminogenic needs, but we don't wait till they commit a crime, and the folks, the criminal justice players, can refer them in. And then something we just started new, which is community engagement, community referrals, called Let Everyone Advance with Dignity. So going back to that Intercept Zero of getting community engagement and community's input on referring folks in. So I'm going to get things over to Najja so we can touch on case management and harm reduction.
Thanks, Brendan. So I would say the key core piece and approach of LEAD is the harm reduction approach. And it is very much rooted in meeting people where they are, looking at people as whole, complete individuals that are deserving of respect and consideration, and that aren't folks that need to be marginalized or disenfranchised from society because somehow they failed. And what we do believe is that the LEAD approach of harm reduction shows up differently, because what it says to people is that you are worthy, you are cared about, and you deserve to have someone that can work with you and move alongside with you in the way in which works for you. That you don't have a disorder that requires you to be boxed away or jailed away or pushed out or basically placed in a place where people can't see you, and that you actually deserve someone to care for you and a community to wrap their arms around you, and for people to step up and offer the services and the care that you deserve as a whole, complete human being that's in need of additional services. So when we work with people in the LEAD program, a few things to understand which are super important. It's very non-coercive. It's not time limited. So someone could be in LEAD as short as 2 months, all the way up to, we still have our first participant in LEAD that started way back in 2011 in the Seattle pilot program. We move at the pace of that person. If someone comes into LEAD and says, I'm interested in housing and interested in maybe a birth certificate and ID, but I have no desire to ever stop using drugs, we're totally fine with that. We work with people where they are and help that person to move along in a pace in a way that makes sense for them. One thing we recognize is that the level of trauma that people experience simply by living on the street, much less all of the compound trauma they've experienced through their lives that brought them to this point where they now are before me, very complex, and it isn't fixed overnight. And it isn't something that throwing them into treatment or making them go somewhere they're not ready for 20 or 30 days is going to fix. So what we do is we look to really find the full person, look at other aspects of that individual that maybe they lost when they were on the streets, or maybe things that happened to them a while ago that they're trying to get back. We look at how they're involved in the community. We look at their family. We look at their health and well-being. We look at other things that might trigger for us or signal to us that there are many, many things that they need to heal from and things that need to be in place before they might even be in a circumstance or in a headspace to be able to consider something like treatment. We really, really want to uplift the individual and give them power and empower them to make choices for their own life. And we kind of see ourselves as the navigators, like they're the director, like they say, I want to go this way. And even if it's something that doesn't necessarily feel like it makes sense to us, we say, okay, let's go that way. And our job is to really focus on keeping them safe, keeping them alive, and keeping the public, increasing public safety as well. I think this also leads to the additional pathway that we just rolled out through our initiative, Let Everyone Advance with Dignity, which is about community referrals and community engagement. And the reason we're so excited about this piece is that with community referrals and engagement, what it allows community members who are closest to the problem to be able to actually make the referrals. We trust the community knows who's struggling. We know the community has eyes on and ears on people who really, really need a different response. And we know from anecdotal stories and firsthand experience that many community members now refuse or are hesitant about calling law enforcement because they're super concerned about the response. And they know in their hearts that it's not the first intercept or intervention that needs to happen at that moment. And so community referrals offers an opportunity for LEAD clients to get into the services, into the care model from someone in their community. Maybe it's a storefront owner, a church member, a business owner, or someone else. It could just be a family member. So this is a piece that we're super excited about. And we really feel like it helps to uplift the goal of LEAD, which is continue to find other responses and other ways to care for these individuals besides the criminal justice system. And I will leave it at that and kick it back to our facilitators so that we can now go into our question and answer portion of our presentation.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mulvey, Najja, and Brendan. This was great. So we have about time for 2 questions. First, I want to, also I'm Kat Sutherland. I'm the interim program manager for the overdose prevention program at the health department. But I wanted to kick it over to Daniel Hickton because he had a question and we just thought it would be easier for him to unmute himself and ask it directly. So Daniel.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask the question here. This kind of picks up on what Professor Ed was touching on and Brendan and Najja were saying here. My question directly here is how can we change the financial equation in our criminal justice system so that our officers are not getting paid overtime for the subpoenas downtown, so they stop making the discretionary arrests based on antiquated CSA laws? The way I see it, there's a broken incentive there that enables them to make those discretionary arrests largely based on drug charges and traffic violations. And I've experienced officers on both sides of the spectrum there. So how can we get these officers more invested in the individual defendant's personal life, their social and professional outcome, rather than their own personal financial gain and the moral wrong that has been committed?
I think that Brendan might be able to answer that one. Yeah.
Thanks, Kat. So yeah, I mean, this is about changing the system, and it is about changing attitudes of officers. So I think, you know, one of the things that comes into play, a couple of things that come into play. One is definitely the operational work group and about getting back the information about how those changes happen, about the differences that the participants have from the regular system. It is about talking about those persistent offenders and how lives change, and about how an officer's day can change based on how we change folks in the community, their behavior, and how we can make it much easier on officers. And it's about that support of upper management, of the command structure, and of middle management, and about changing the way we ultimately respond to calls. And then it can also be about changing policy. Listen, most of my career, I think for about the first 15 years of my career, officers went to arraignments and got paid 3 hours of overtime. I certainly benefited from that when I was a young cop. And I'm certainly not going to hide that officers weren't like, hey, I'm going to go out and make my 3 hours now because I work off hours, and that's what officers did. And we eventually pulled the Band-Aid off and said no more going to arraignments. But we actually then offered, once we started LEAD, we offered officers who made diversions that worked in off hours the chance to come into an operational work group so they could actually see what was going on when they made a diversion and have a chance to give some input, because we wanted them to understand all the work that was happening with the diversion. So we actually flipped the coin around and said, hey, here's an opportunity to be able to see what happens in LEAD when you do something different. So some of it is just changing the way the department thinks. A lot of it is changing the entire, it's not just changing the system outside, but it's also about changing the system, the culture within the department. And certainly the folks that I've been on the line with from law enforcement in Allegheny County, it's clear that the law enforcement leaders in Allegheny County are looking to change the culture and make sure that their officers and deputies are ultimately changing the way they do business.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, we've also heard that they can start incentivizing diversion instead too. So then there's another question, and this is targeted towards Dr. Mulvey. Dr. Mulvey, you briefly mentioned that public defenders, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about whether or how public defenders are trained to ensure their clients' mental health issues are being addressed appropriately. For example, the idea of a standardized behavioral or mental health score upon arrest sounds good at first, but what if a person is then stigmatized upon later arrest because they were previously given a bad score or misdiagnosed and untreated?
Yeah, I think that's a reality. I don't think public defenders are the absolute best clinicians in the world, and should be, you know, given these sorts of situations to decide whether this should go forward or not. I think the presence of public defenders really is to expand the factors considered, expand the consideration of the court on the context of the event, not necessarily say this person's mentally ill, therefore let them go. I don't think that's a real reasonable way to go about their role. And I don't think that most of them really do go about their role that way. It's part of the problem with getting mental health, behavioral health information into the early parts of the system have to do with the thing you mentioned of stigmatizing cases or people not wanting that information out there. I mean, if you've got to get some way of people agreeing to release that to their public defender in a way that may be helpful or not. The Manhattan courts have done a rapid way of people deciding they wanted to go to their public defender or don't want to go to public defender. And I think that's really ultimately, when you get to more elaborate, like preliminary hearings or that sort of thing, it's one thing. The arraignment process, I don't know if you've ever sat through arraignment court, but it's pretty much a run them in, crank them out, move them out. You know, I mean, this is not a detailed stigmatizing even, it's hardly even an event, you know, so if you can put the public defender there and allow them to make it into a considered response, I think in the long run, they'll be better off. But I agree with you, that's the person has to be in charge of how much of that information goes where. And it always has the potential to be used negatively against individuals. So you got to let people control it.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And then we have time for one more question. How do we persuade law enforcement entities, particularly DAs, who believe that diversion programs are soft on crime to onboard?
Show them the proof in the pudding. I mean, we have not only the research, but you know, we talk about the persistent offenders. You know, I mean, we can tell the stories the reality of the people that have been arrested 40, 50, 60 times, who in LEAD programs around the country, we can show, hey, once we diverted this person, this is how they got better. They didn't get better overnight. We're never going to come into some place and say, hey, we diverted them on Tuesday and on Wednesday they were perfect. Folks have been through a ton of trauma in their life. Folks have had horrible experiences and need to get over a lot of things that our case managers do wonderful work with. But if all you're looking for is the satisfaction of putting the handcuffs on somebody and bringing them to central booking, and you think that's a win, you're probably going to prove that you're practicing insanity of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The LEAD is not meant for everybody, but LEAD is very much meant for persistent offenders that have unmet behavioral health needs. And we've been able to show in a number of jurisdictions that this can work, that when we take this person-centered approach with a harm reduction philosophy, with real street-based long-term case management, we can make a difference in people's lives and improve public safety.
Hey, can I just comment on that? I agree with that totally. What Brendan's saying is that, show them how you can make it work for them. The other way of making it work for them is, I don't have as many people may have a very cynical view of how district attorney's offices work, but I don't think they want to spend a lot of time on these cases. They don't want to spend a lot of resources. They're pushed already to cover and do processing of papers and meet deadlines for filing cases and everything else. If you can convince them that there's going to be no real political downside to identifying cases, treating them intensively, or identifying cases in other ways and moving them out of your system, that gives them more time to work on guns and people being beaten up and things like that. They've got to see the evidence, and they've got to see the advantage to not tying up resources on cases that really aren't going anywhere for them.
Thank you all.
Thank you.